Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here today, and we'll say without question, this is a lot more fun than any privacy or legal conferences that I've ever attended, for sure. So they have a lot of work to do. So I'm going to be talking about big data and privacy specifically, and what I want to do is keep it focused in this industry, but also you'll start to see how it's a common thread throughout. This is not industry specific. So in my work, I work with organizations of all shapes and sizes in all different industries, but I think in the interactive entertainment space, you can really explore in a more meaningful way a lot of these issues because it's just a microcosm of everything that we deal with. But I want to kind of start by talking about how this all came into my life and where we are with privacy and data security today, because I think it's a good way to introduce the topic. In the summer of 2003, on June 27th, 2003, my son was born. On July 1st, 2003, the day I brought him home from the hospital, California's first in the nation data breach notification law took effect. At the time, I didn't realize that both events would have an absolutely life-changing effect for me. And I have spent the rest of my career, at the time I was a general commercial litigator, and because of what happened in California, in part at that time, my entire career changed to focus on addressing the risks associated with the collection, maintenance, sharing of large amounts of data. The issues have only become even more complex since then. So now we have my son and California's law entering teenagerhood. And both things have come with some interesting twists and turns that I think will be very difficult to sort out, but remarkably, most organizations, including those in media and entertainment, are woefully unprepared still to deal with the impact and the risks associated with handling so much data, even after more than a decade of living with these breach response laws, and in some cases, in certain industries, going even farther back than that. So what is privacy? And why do we care about it? Privacy is very hard to define, and even the most advanced scholars in the space really don't have a good way to get at it. Over 100 years ago, the theory was it's the right to be left alone, which is one way to consider it. But more recently, it seems to be about control and the individual's ability to control how their information is used and shared by third parties, which is a really important concept in your world that I'll talk a little bit more about as we go along here. Why do we care? Because we want to be able to build communities of consumers, of gamers in your case, who trust and feel that they have that control, even if your organizations, or whoever it may be, are holding vast amounts of data, and the risks associated with that are potentially huge if your users trust, and if you build that relationship of trust, which goes way beyond legal compliance, and I'll talk more about that, then you can have those kinds of relationships and build that user base and those communities. So I'm going to start with all the terrible things, right, that we think about when we talk about privacy and data security. What is it that we're all so worried about, or we think we're worried about? And it's really about the perceived threats, and some of them are real threats. Government surveillance, so Snowden, think how the perception that has spread as a result of the Snowden revelations in 2013 have changed fundamentally how people think about privacy, at least here in this country, in the US, sorry, I don't know where I am. In Europe, actually, things have always been a little bit more focused on these issues. And over the last year, there's been a lot of fallout coming in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations, because the Europeans have never felt, and in some cases rightfully so, that the United States and most countries in the world, frankly, have an adequate legal system to protect privacy, individual privacy rights. In Europe, privacy is a fundamental right, which is not the case in the United States under our Constitution, except in California and a few states. So I've decided that California should just become its own little country, and we can just transfer all the data to California and it'll be all right. That would be a solution to the problem. But in any event, because of some of these concerns, there were always questions about some of the legal mechanisms for transferring data, and some of you may be familiar with a case from late last year called the Schrems case, in which he challenged Facebook's transfers of data to the US under what was called the safe harbor framework, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on it, but at the end of the day, the EU decided the safe harbor framework, which had been in place since 2000, really wasn't sufficiently protective of European citizen rights, with this concern about US government surveillance and the ability of the US government to get their hands on data from Facebook and other large companies. And so they struck down a mechanism that over 4,000 organizations have been relying on to transfer data. All coming out of this concern primarily about government surveillance. So putting the private sector at the mercy of these ongoing political negotiations, while in the meantime, in reality, the world keeps spinning, data keeps flowing, and we've been living in that kind of state of uncertainty since then, but now have some potential replacements for that. So government surveillance, one big issue. Oh, and I should mention that it's widely recognized that many European countries and other places around the world are engaged in similar kinds of surveillance, and yet it hasn't quite had the same, it doesn't seem to have an effect on their criticism of the US and what it's doing. So that's one really big issue that affects everyone. Cyber attacks, obviously huge. I'm going to talk about one in particular that was in the news last month because it's highly relevant to your industry. Identity theft coming out of cyber attacks and other kinds of incidents. Many data breaches, by the way, are not caused by outsiders, third-party wrongdoers. Many are caused by human error, internal human error, not even necessarily rogue employees, but just people who don't understand the significance of carrying around so much data, and we still see to this day the vast majority of incidents coming from internal mistake. Other concerns that are related to privacy issues, discrimination, even based on profiling of individuals, so price discrimination. These are the kinds of things that the FTC is looking at. Scoring of consumers, not quite rising to the level of what we're used to in sort of the credit reporting sense, but still a major concern, and sort of looking at data brokers who create these consumer segments, again, highly relevant to your industry and others. And things like cyberbullying and revenge porn, which start to sound more like and be more like safety concerns and even criminal issues, not quite as much purely privacy, but again, the inability to remain anonymous or to fully control one's information has a direct relationship to that. So I do want to talk about one particular incident that was reported last month. I didn't have any direct involvement in this, so what I'm saying is purely based on what I've read in the papers, but it's a good example of what can happen in this industry. So the report was that hackers breached a site, a news site called DLH.net, and stole about 9.1 million passwords that were used for the Steam platform. Among the things that they got a hold of apparently were names, email addresses, dates of birth, avatars, user activity, in cases where users had used their Facebook accounts, they got stuff out of their Facebook accounts, and they were actually able to decrypt their passwords because the hashing algorithm that had been used wasn't that strong. And that's 9.1, assuming this is all true, right? And I do always question that when I read these reports, because I have been involved in some where things are written that are simply untrue. But assuming that it's true, these are high-profile, high-value targets for people who either just want to see if they can break in, and sometimes that's all it is, and for truly, bad actors who would take this information and do terrible things with it and use it to possibly ruin people's lives or take over their online identities or real identities. And so it can be a really scary thing. But data is everywhere. And the question is, how do we use this data in a way to nurture communities instead of tearing them down and thinking of it as just a threat and a risk? Because I do believe that there is a lot of value, and that especially in this industry, the ability to build and experience the kinds of things you're hearing about this morning, which completely blow my mind, an immersive experience for people is critically linked to the ability to leverage that data, to give those users an experience that is tailored for them and that allows them to have that kind of transcendent experience that you were hearing about. So how do we do that? Well, I think it really is, what is the value proposition, obviously, for the gamer? And just because it can't be simple, that value proposition is highly, highly contextual. So audience-specific, generational, very personal, and so knowing that, you have to somehow be able to predict how much you can do with the data that you have while still maintaining a balance where that value proposition for the user is higher and more valuable, the benefit is greater than the potential risk or the fear, the perceived risk involved there. So different audiences, I'll talk about a few specific different audiences to think about in this respect. Here's the 13-year-old. I don't know what he's playing here. My husband is sitting in the back, he probably knows. But what are his expectations? This generation, I believe, so I'm thinking about teenagers in particular, they want to share everything all the time, online, through social media, even the most ridiculous, absurd, terrible, life-damaging stuff. But they do not want third parties of any kind to do that without their permission. And they really do feel strongly about this. And so I know that there are some people who think that this generation doesn't really care, doesn't really matter, we can kind of do whatever we want. And there really is no privacy for these kids. But I think it's actually, I think that it may be a little bit contrary to that. I think that they know that they want to control their information. They want to have the right to control their information. If they themselves are going to do stupid things, sure. But whether it's their parents or gaming companies or other third-party platforms, social media, the government, they want those people to obtain their expressed consent before using and sharing their data in a way that's inconsistent with the brand they've created for themselves and the identity that they have curated for themselves, whether they realize that they've done it or not. And I think that that's critical to remember, that consent factor is not something that can be assumed. And certainly here again in Europe, it is very much the case that you cannot do things with data that are inconsistent with a user's expectations without express consent, which is a very different model from what we're used to in the US, where we tend to live in an opt-out world, opt-out environment. It comes as a great surprise, particularly on the marketing side in the US, to learn that. And I think that the same is true for all of the interesting kinds of data sharing that could go on in a gaming environment, gaming ecosystem. Kids, real kids. This is my other one. She's using an iPad, which she has been able to use since she was like 1. And she, when she reads paper books, she goes like this, because she doesn't understand why it's not moving. So what do we have to think about with kids? Verified parental consent. So I'm talking under 13 now, right? In the US, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, is the law that we deal with, federal law. And it's one of those sectoral laws that we have in the States that the Europeans don't think are sufficient in general, but it is very stringent with respect to children. So verified parental consent has a particular meaning, but it means that you can't just throw up a website or a game or whatever that not only just one that's targeted at kids, that clearly if it's targeted at under 13, you have to worry about this. But even if it's something that could attract kids, right, you have to think about it. And then even more complicated, you can't just throw something up there that says, don't play this, you can't do this if you're under 13, because that's just a cue to the child that they have to lie about it. And the Federal Trade Commission says, no, 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 that's not how you do it. So the instinct is usually to just say, oh, we'll say, you know, don't do it if you're this age, and if they keep going, then we can trust that they are the correct age. And that's simply not the case. And so you have to get involved with age gating in an appropriate way, and age gating that's meaningful, meaning that somebody can't just back pay, you know, you have to set it up so they can't just go back a page, put in a new age, and again, game the system. Even if you are a site or a game that is targeted to adults or to a general audience, and if you have actual knowledge that you have collected the information of a child under 13, even if you never intended to, but you now have it and you know that you have it, that pulls you in as well, which a lot of folks don't realize. And actually Yelp got in trouble for this in relatively recent history because they had an ineffective age gate that was set up. So in other words, if you have an age gate that collects the age and you know that you now have, you know, data of somebody under 13, you have to either get rid of it or get parental consent for that, and that can be a big trap. International laws are as problematic, if not more so sometimes, because sometimes in certain international jurisdictions you have to worry about older than 13 as well, maybe up to the age of majority, and so that's an issue. Safety concerns with kids, of course, huge thing to consider. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about Pokemon, because that was one that attracted a lot of attention recently on that, and again, cyberbullying. So the kids' issues are going to continue to be, I think, highly, a really dense area of risk in this industry. So lessons from Pokemon, and I this is not to pick on Pokemon, it's just that it's fascinating. I actually have a professor friend, a privacy professor friend, who has kind of been joking, although I'm not sure he's joking anymore, that he's going to design an entire law school course just about Pokemon Go, because there's so many interesting issues that have come up. But here's why it's so interesting. You know, massive data collection, not unlike a lot of other games, but there was some initial very negative press around the privacy settings issue, which I'm sure people read about, where the question was, there was a disclosure that suggested that if you sign up with your Google account, that all of your information in Google, including your emails, including like everything, would go to the company. However, so there was some question, was it just a poorly drafted disclosure? If so, how could that happen? You know, why wasn't that more well planned? It did get changed, and they said, oh, no, 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 that's not what we meant. It's just your, you know, your email address and your basic account information. We never had everything. But because of the way it was presented in the press initially, it raised a lot of questions that haven't really completely gone away. And so it does sort of make you think, and one way to look at this is, well, you know, if that kind of data collection was going on, why? We really need to collect all of that in the first place. And if not, and if it was just a poorly drafted disclosure, why wasn't that piece of it, you know, thought out more? And it's a good lesson for purposes of, you know, when you're launching and building in these considerations in the beginning instead of having to deal with it in a reactive fashion. That being said, even though that happened, it kind of just fizzled, at least that news cycle just kind of fizzled eventually, and the offering is so compelling, and even parents, who are the ones who seem to be the most concerned about the privacy issues in the beginning, are so enamored of it because it gets the kids out walking around in the real world, because they're in the game even when they're out in the real world, that that value proposition appears to outweigh whatever concern ultimately was there from a privacy perspective. I've heard of almost nobody who has said to their kids, no, you can't do it because I'm worried about this privacy issue, or kids who have said, oh gosh, yeah, I don't want them to have all my, you know, so I'm not going to do it. No, nobody's doing that. Everybody's out there playing. So it's because it's such a compelling offering in that respect. There are some other issues, though, that have come up with respect, or either they have come up or they are likely to come up, that I'll point out because I think, again, in terms of more broadly, not just unique to the Pokemon situation, but more broadly, what are the kinds of things you have to think about in this context? So kids, which we talked about, verified parental consent, geolocation information, which is considered to be, even by the Federal Trade Commission in the US, to be highly sensitive data, which is a little surprising to some people, especially because a lot of these things don't work at all without geolocation information. And obviously you make a conscious choice if you're gonna play a game that relies on that. Of course you're sharing your information, but at the same time it does allow potentially someone who shouldn't have the data, should it fall into their hands, allows them to track, say, a child everywhere they go, right? So there is that. Data sharing in general, with this kind of a game, there are huge opportunities, obviously, for, you know, cross promotions and joint marketing and location-based marketing, all of which is happening, and a lot of data sharing for that reason, right? Well, in Germany, for example, the German regulators have already come out and said, we think this is too much data sharing and it's going beyond the scope of why the person gave you the data in the first place. And we can all sort of say, well, is it really, you know, like, is it? Because, but it is already subject to scrutiny from regulators as possibly going beyond the context of that data collection. Does a game like that become a data broker because it's aggregating and collecting so much data that it could then repackage and share profiles, user profiles, to third parties who could do all kinds of things with it, maybe use it to score consumers for their likelihood to buy other things, or even in connection with their eligibility for certain kinds of products and services? That's another kind of thing that might attract the attention of regulators and to consider. And even going beyond what the Germans are doing, looking at that, in the States, we already have several inquiries that have been made. Senator Franken made an inquiry about the game. EPIC, which is one of the big privacy advocacy groups, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, filed a complaint with the FTC about it, I believe. And there's been some private lawsuits already that have been filed. And that's just on the privacy issues. I'm not even getting into like the parents who allegedly left their 2-year-old at home while they went out and played the game, or the kids who walked off a cliff or whatever, you know, forget that. But so there are a lot of really interesting questions that have to be fleshed out. But ultimately, if the value proposition is significant enough, it would appear that it is still something that consumers will flock to. So it's just a lot of food for thought there. All right, so I think that brings us kind of to the concluding point, which I think I'm good on my timing, which is trust. How do we overcome all of these issues and all these risks and concerns? It boils down to trust, which is what every single study shows is the key piece of what allows users to give up all that information in the first place. And there is the fact that the information is probably already out there, right? But some people, it's just not enough to say, well, you know, it's out there anyway, and so what's one other sort of thing? You actually have to gain the trust in the particular context in which you are seeking to use the data. So how do you earn it? Key question. But I think that it has a lot to do with not just complying with what the law says you have to do with the bare minimum, right? And there are plenty of times when clients come and say, all right, what do we absolutely have to do to make sure it's legally compliant? And not, you know, this is true in all different contexts, but true here as well. You know, what do we absolutely have to do to make sure from a privacy standpoint we're complying? That should really probably not be the question. The question is, what is it we have to do to convey to our users that we care and that we are going to be trustworthy custodians of their data, that we are going to hold it in a way that is not going to land it in the hands of third parties who shouldn't have it, whether those be bad guys who would do harm or the government or whoever else. But also importantly, not overstating those promises, because one of my biggest pet peeves is actually privacy policies that start with, we value your privacy and we're gonna do everything to protect it, right? Everybody likes to start privacy policies that way. But it's simply not true. And the Federal Trade Commission has actually come after companies for making allegedly deceptive statements in situations where, say, they have a breach. And everybody's gonna have a breach, right? There's no way you're not gonna have a breach at some point. You know, everyone in information security will tell you you've either had one or you're gonna have one, or you just don't know that you've had one. So it's not about promising the world and things that you can't control. It's about being honest, being transparent, not gathering as much data as you possibly can, because someday we may want to use that data for some reason, and so we should just get it now and then we'll figure out later what we're gonna do with it, right? It's what do we really need and how are we going to use it, and then down the road, what do we think we might want to specifically, and how can we prepare for that? But it should be a purpose limitation, data minimization. How do we build the relationship with the user such that they're gonna trust us to come back to us and give us more if we need it and if we want it? And how do you keep it? How do you keep the trust? I think that question is just as important, and it means not changing the game after it's begun and not making sudden huge changes in your practices, sharing with certain third parties or other things that could cause folks to really ask questions. And in my experience, the biggest enemy of trust is misinformation. And I've read some really interesting articles lately that have got me really thinking about this, because I think that the media, not to blame the media for everything, but I think that the media is in large part to blame for the perception that everyone's privacy is gone, and that all large organizations that experience any kind of an incident of any kind, and most do, are to be blamed for having poor security practices or for not handling users' data in an appropriate way. And so I think a focus on not just user communications and the communications with your communities, but also with the media, with the press, to make sure that there is accurate information going out, because once the bad information is out there and it gets propagated by everyone, it is almost impossible, and that's what these articles say, is almost impossible to change people's minds once the misinformation is out there, which I'm sure you all are quite familiar with that dynamic. So I think that it is absolutely possible to build positive relationships with the gaming communities, with your user communities, that will allow you to use data in all of these groundbreaking ways that will allow you to live forever. We heard this morning, right? For the users to live forever, you got to have a lot of data about them to help them live forever. But you really do have to gain that trust, go above and beyond the mere legal compliance, and show them that you are a partner that they want to work with for a very long period of time. So with that, my time is definitely up, and I look forward to further discussing the roundtables tomorrow. So thank you.